Alright, so in this video we're going to take a look at Cinema 4D's parametric primitives. So within the command group up here on the right, you'll see this blue cube and a little drop down arrow to the right. That always signifies that there's sub-objects or subtools located beneath any icon. So if I click and hold that down, I'll expand the group, and in any case where you have this this pull down, if you go up to that top grip and just click and release, you can open up a floating panel with all those controls or objects inside. So the first one listed here is a null object that does not hold any actual geometry. Those who are coming over from After Effects are probably familiar with the null object system, and it's really just a good grouping and organizational tool, particularly in animation, for setting up a hierarchy and sometimes just setting a clean animation start for your objects. The first one we'll look at here is the cube object. So as I click and add that in here, we see the basic parameters listed here in the attribute manager. So we have our X, Y, and Z size, as well as our X, Y, and Z segmentation. If we have our display set to something that displays lines, we'll actually be able to see as we add these segments into our model, we'll see those visually within the viewport. So pretty standard. Couple of things here. Separate surfaces would split each plane into a separate object when we went to make this object editable and get into the actual geometric makeup of the object. And the other option here is fillet, and if I add a fillet there, you'll see it adds rounding to the edges, and we can control the radius and the segmentation for those fillets. Alright, so that's the cube object. Then we have the cone object. And so we're going to get some different parameters here. You'll notice also some new tabs have shown up for the attributes within the attribute manager of this. So we have a top radius. So for setting up a construction cone or a lampshade, we could raise the top radius. You also obviously have a bottom radius you can adjust, the height, and the segmentation once again. In this case, where you have non-symmetrical shapes, so we have top controls and bottom controls, you'll have the option for orientation. So do we want this directed towards the plus Z or the minus Z or any other orientation? In this case, plus Y is fine. A couple other things that you'll see here. Go to the selection tool here. So when you first add these models, you'll oftentimes see these orange handles, and these are interactive controls for those same parameters. So for example, this little handle here controls my top radius, while this handle controls my bottom radius, and then the center top controls the height. And you'll see this with the cube, you'll see this with all the objects that we can add in here. They'll have different kinds of controls that you can use right inside your 3D space. One adder here is the caps option. So if I go to the caps tab, I can see options for how the cap is being created, how many segments the cap has. I can also enable fillet on these as well. So if I go to top and bottom, now I've opened up fillet options, and so in this case you could create something like a Hershey's Kiss. So if I went back to my object tab and lowered the radius there and maybe bring down the height a little bit and probably raise those rotational segments, and maybe a little bit of the fillet. And so you can create all kinds of different types of shapes within these parametric primitives just by adjusting things like the caps and the fillets and those type options. Also here you'll have the slice option. This is common amongst some of the objects here, and you'll see that this is also a keyframeable attribute, so you can animate things being created this way. Take it back to the halfway point. And as you'll see, especially when we get into spline-based modeling, you'll often end up with really irregular surfaces. And those can be a problem when it comes time to texture and also animate. So you'll oftentimes see this option here for regular grid, where it tries to really uniform those shapes. And so I can get it to be more of a regular grid type quad subdivision by lowering the width of all these. And of course, by doing so, I am increasing the size of the complexity of the model. We have the cylinder. It's going to be very similar as far as controls for height and radius and orientation. So you'll see slice options, cap options. So as in the case with the other, with the cone, if I were making a lampshade out of that shape, so let's say this is just one of those cylindrical lampshades, obviously wouldn't want to have a cap at the top and bottom, so you can actually deactivate caps on these parametric primitives as well. Then you end up with open tops and bottoms for these shapes. And again, also we'll have orientation options for the cylinder object. Next we have the disc. And with the disc is added the inner radius, outer radius control. So if you're creating a DVD or a Blu-ray, you can just add a little bit of an inner radius to this. And again, we have those handles that allow us to control this directly within the viewport. And you have your disc segmentation. So that's kind of your concentric dividers and your radial dividers. And one thing to note here is if you get in close to these shapes, these rounded parametric primitives, they may look good from a distance. When it's time to render and you get in close, you'll notice how blocky they are. So it's a good bet you'll need to raise those rotational segments. So if I take this up to maybe 128 and now do a render, we're going to have much smoother edges on those outer edges. Again, you have orientation options, slice options as well. Keep in mind, again, all these are totally keyframeable, adjustable at any time as long as this object is still a parametric primitive. But when you're ready to go in and create a more advanced model and you want to be able to get into the actual points and edges and polygons, at that point you would make this object editable. You'd press the C key or go to the Make Editable button here. Then you've lost those parameters. You can no longer go in and change the inner radius and the outer radius. But what you can do is actually go in and select elements of the geometry and begin to do other types of modeling, such as extrusions and inner extrusions, and really build up more complex shapes. All right, a lot of these are going to be similar, so we're going to skip most of these. I do want to look at the sphere object. So just looking at this in the viewport, you'll see it looks kind of blocky. When I go to render, it's a perfect sphere, and that's thanks to this parameter right here, render perfect. If I uncheck that and render this, it looks exactly the way you would think, as it has kind of that blocky look to it. So if I have render perfect enabled, it doesn't matter how small the subdivision level, it's going to render a perfect sphere. Now, if I were to make this object editable, you lose that functionality as well. It's just going to render the actual geometry that's within the shape. And one thing I want to point out here is how the sphere is subdivided. So you'll notice I have nice quads all around the outer sides of this shape, but when I go up to the top, I get this triangular pinning into a singular center point, and that's by default how the sphere is created using the standard type. Luckily, we have other options for how the sphere is created. So a lot of times you're going to need your sphere to be made up of all quads, and in those cases you'll need to set it to a hexahedron, and you'll see that makes up our mesh in a different way, still providing us with a spherical shape, but we have all quads. And I'm going to turn up my subdivision level here, get a little smoother shape. There's some other cool options here as well. Here's a tetrahedron, which gives you those triangular mesh, as will most of these. Octahedron, icosahedron, and lastly we have a hemisphere. So if you're wanting to add a dome around a scene or something like that, you can just add a hemisphere type sphere to your scene. Pretty cool. Alright, the last one I'm going to look at in this quick video is the landscape object, just because it's so different and so powerful within Cinema 4D. So we have, again, size options, segmentation options. We have these rough and fine furrow options, which go into the details of how this landscape object is created. And you can kind of think about this as being made up of a noise shader. So it's just a black and white image displacing this plane. And so anywhere where that noise shader would be white, we're getting higher peaks, and anywhere where it's black, we're getting down to our base. And so it's kind of just a noisy texture that's making this effect. And so we're changing the dynamics of that, changing the noise and the fine details within that, controlling these furrow options. You also have the sea level option. So if I raise the sea level, it's going to bring more of our geometry down to the base. So you can create cool things like islands and things of that nature by raising that sea level value. Vice versa, you want to create kind of an out west Monument Valley type effect. You can lower the plateau value, and you're going to end up with these really cool looking mountain forms. And again, I can go through and change the orientation. Multifractal is just the way it's calculated, so it just calculates in a different way, creating the effect. And then I have the seed value, and this is really powerful within Cinema 4D. This gives me thousands of iterations based on these parameters. It's kind of a random calculator. So as I go through, without changing any other settings, I'm getting thousands and thousands of different looks based on these parameters. So you can create some really cool looking stuff using the seeds until you get one that you're really happy with. So really cool. Border at sea level, if I turn that off, so you can see that it no longer brings everything to 0 at the edges. And so this is good if you're inside a scene. You're not going to be at a distance where you can see the outer edges. You don't need them to nicely go into a floor plane or an ocean or something like that. You can turn that off. And let me take back up my plateau value so you can see this a little bit better. And so it applies the noise to the entire shape. Again, you can get some really cool effects this way. And then lastly, I have the spherical option. So if I want to create something like a meteorite or an asteroid, I can do that right inside here. And again, do all kinds of adjustments with the seed value. So hopefully this has given you a nice overview of the parametric primitives within Cinema 4D. And keep in mind these are just the base building blocks for creating some really cool models within Cinema 4D.